In a world in which alliances no longer guarantee security, deterrence becomes a necessity. So far, no other form of it has proven more efficient than nuclear. So, are we on the brink of an era of new, unlimited nuclear proliferation? Stay with me to find out, here on Wider View. And I'm your host, Mateusz Mazzini. Good evening. Our main story tonight focuses on the ultimate instrument in any geopolitical negotiations: nuclear weapons. Since Donald Trump's return to the White House, many in Europe and elsewhere have begun to question America's commitment to collective security. As the United States has repeatedly threatened Canada and Greenland, the future of Article 5 appears gloomier by the day. In the absence of any reliable ally in Washington, more and more countries are beginning to wonder how they can successfully deter a potential invasion. And most of them reach the same conclusion: only nuclear weapons can hold off the likes of Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Kim Jong-un. With rapid technological advancement, lack of international oversight, and multiple new military conflicts, nuclear proliferation seems unavoidable right now. But is this necessarily a bad thing? We explore the global nuclear landscape in our report.
There are currently 9 known nuclear powers in the world. This club, previously thought to be very exclusive, could soon become much bigger. A handful of other states could be capable of quickly ushering their own nuclear programs. After all, this is not a new technology. It will soon be 90 years old, and the technological and economic barriers for development are getting lower and lower. The geopolitical shifts of recent months pushed many leaders to at least consider acquiring their own nuclear weapons. The Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk hinted towards it in a recent speech in his country's parliament. Others, including the likely future German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, talk about nuclear sharing. This solution, although less controversial, is not as simple as it sounds. Germany or Poland could theoretically find themselves under the French nuclear umbrella. But President Emmanuel Macron made a point of reminding everyone that he will remain in control of the red button. Similarly, talk about nuclear armaments have resurfaced in Asia. South Korea and Japan are 2 local powers entirely dependent on the US for security. They are also in an extremely hostile region, with 3 nuclear superpowers as neighbors. Although the Trump administration declares the Pacific theater a priority, some have their doubts. Asia, contrary to Europe, does not have a collective defense architecture. In the event of a conflict, everyone will be left to fend for themselves. There are other ways to pursue deterrence, but conventional rearmament takes time and money. With a global trade war raging, it might be cheaper to move towards nuclear weapons. But in defense, cheaper and quicker does not always mean better.
Is nuclear proliferation unavoidable? Who will be next to develop a fully functioning system of nuclear weapons? And are we ever going to see again a functioning framework of international nuclear arms control? The topic of nuclear weapons always sounds like the last resort, and that's because it is. So let's try to find answers to those questions with the help of our experts. I'm pleased to say joining me tonight on Wider View are Daryl Kimball, Executive Director of the Arms Control Association, and Sharon Squassoni, Professor of International Affairs at George Washington University. Good evening and welcome to Wider View.
Good evening.
Sharon, I want to begin with you and ask you sort of a state of affairs question, if you please. Is, from a global standpoint, the nuclear threshold lower than ever right now?
By threshold, I take it you mean the ability of countries to develop nuclear weapons. I think the interest in nuclear weapons is higher, primarily because of uncertainties about the United States as an ally. We have had a very successful nuclear non-proliferation regime since the 1970s. But a key element of that has been U.S. assurances, alliances, NATO, bilateral alliances. And I think what you're seeing now is a lot of uncertainty about how the U.S. is going to act. And that fuels, I think, interest in nuclear weapons, which, in my view, is misplaced.
And what would you say is misplaced then? Because for many theoretical, at least, or legal allies of the United States, both in Europe, but I think also in the Indo-Pacific theater, it looks more and more like a safer option, at least from a tactical strategic point of view.
Well, it depends on your view whether nuclear weapons makes you more secure or less secure. A lot of the U.S. national security resides in, its strong economy, its conventional defenses. I think there's what I think is misplaced is this idea that nuclear weapons make you safer. I mean, if we look at what Russia is doing in Ukraine, nuclear weapons have, even though Russia has made some very vague threats, they haven't been able to use nuclear weapons to their advantage in achieving what appears to them, or what they say is a very strategic goal. Nuclear weapons contain risks, and the United States has not been immune to that. There are risks of miscalculation. There are risks of inadvertent use. I mean, there's a whole history of accidents that we have endured. But also, the question is, if you have a world in which there are many, many nuclear powers, how do you assess the risk that there won't be a nuclear exchange as a result of miscalculation? And in this environment today where there's so much disinformation, I would think that that would be a strong argument to say that having these incredibly destructive weapons doesn't necessarily make you safer.
We're going to get to the decision-making process about nuclear weapons in a second, but on that note, I want to move to you, Daryl, and bring some more practicalities to this discussion. How long does it actually take right now to develop a fully functioning nuclear weapons system from scratch? Because it isn't a particularly new technology. It's been around for decades, and we have a handful of countries that are economically developed, that are technologically very capable. How long would that take for them to develop a system like that?
Well, as we think about that somewhat straightforward question, I mean, we need to think about the technical challenges, the political challenges that exist to acquiring nuclear weapons. And there is a reason why today there are only 9 nuclear armed states. 9 is too many, but it is partly because it is very difficult technologically to acquire the materials for nuclear weapons. You need to have either highly enriched uranium, which is only can be done with highly sophisticated industrial capabilities, or plutonium, which also requires sophisticated technological capabilities to extract plutonium from spent nuclear fuel. Then you need to be able to have the scientific knowledge and the scientific and industrial base to design a nuclear explosive device, to perfect it so that it is small enough to be delivered on an aircraft or on a ballistic missile. And then that involves another form of technology. You need to have a sophisticated aircraft that's capable of dropping a gravity bomb a nuclear bomb or ballistic missile capability. And as we've seen, there are a limited number of countries around the world with all of these sophisticated capabilities. It takes time to develop all of them, and there are legal and political barriers against the acquisition of each of these capabilities. Now, it's not foolproof, but it would be time-consuming, very expensive, and politically challenging for any one nation, Poland, South Korea, to do this, even though they are advanced industrial countries. Right now, we see Iran having spent decades first secretly acquiring the technologies necessary to enrich uranium, stealing that from a European consortium of uranium enrichment companies.
I'm going to jump on this real quick, and understanding that we're dealing in the realm of hypotheticals here and political doubts and political capital aside, if you were to single out the countries that are most likely, purely from a technological standpoint, to be able to develop a nuclear weapons system, who would that be?
It depends on which country we're talking about. And so first I was going to say Iran is months away from acquiring the materials for nuclear weapons. It probably has the knowledge to develop a nuclear weapon. It has ballistic missiles that could theoretically carry them. So it is no more than maybe 1 to 2 years away if allowed to do so. South Korea has expressed an interest in having the capability. It would likely be able to do so within 2 to 3 years if political barriers were not in the way. Japan in a similar situation. I think it would be longer for a country like Poland if it really wanted to do this. But these are all, at this stage, sophisticated industrial countries with most of the technological means to acquire the materials, the weapons.
So, Sharon, one of the other buzzwords that gets thrown around these days, especially in pundits' commentary, is nuclear deterrence and nuclear sharing or nuclear umbrella. And we see right now on the screen a global map of different nuclear alliances in different parts of the world covered by different treaties or different bilateral agreements. But if you could, also taking into consideration the information we see on the screen, explain to us how nuclear sharing actually works as a mechanism.
Yeah, nuclear sharing, I think, in some respects is misunderstood. And that goes back to my point earlier about assurances, right? So one of the reasons why the United States has a nuclear sharing nuclear planning group within NATO is because many countries would be out of their minds to simply hand over this decision to use nuclear weapons, perhaps even on their own soil, to a foreign country, right? So they want a say in it. But how much of a say do they have in this? There aren't, there's a NATO nuclear planning group. The U.S. just made an agreement with South Korea because South Korea wanted a similar arrangement. But I think even the South Koreans overestimated what, how much input they might have to that decision. So, this is in a way, papering over those profound political chasms, I guess I would say, about, who ultimately is going to make that decision. I think in the clip that you showed earlier, France has proposed or, is talking about a kind of sharing, but I don't think anybody really believes that France is going to hand over a nuclear weapon and let another country make that decision. One of the reasons why the United States has done so much in this arena is because it did not look at a future world with many, many nuclear weapon states and see that as a security win, right? It becomes much more complicated for everyone. And so nuclear deterrence and nuclear nonproliferation are profoundly linked. And, my recommendation is if you want to do better with nuclear nonproliferation and reduce the incentive for countries to get their own nuclear weapons, at this point, I think you really do either need to shore up your alliances and your nuclear deterrence, or alternatively, decide that nuclear weapons don't really enhance your security and make a strong movement, a strong effort to actually move towards nuclear disarmament.
Well, the Polish president seems to be of a slightly different opinion. I'm going to stay with you, Sharon, on that and quote an interview that President Andrzej Duda gave to the Financial Times just recently, in which he stated it's obvious that Poland should be able and be given a chance to host American nuclear weapons. The exact quotation was, "The borders of NATO moved east in 1999, so 26 years later, there should be also a shift of the NATO infrastructure east. For me, this is obvious, and I think not only that the time has come, but it would be safer if those weapons were already here, meaning in Poland." What's your quick take on that?
Well, let's distinguish between a country acquiring their own nuclear weapons, which has all of the risks that Daryl enumerated, and putting U.S. nuclear weapons on an ally's soil. I think those are two very different things, and they kind of get conflated in the media. Ultimately, it's very difficult to tell another country how secure it should be feeling. We withdrew many, many nuclear weapons from all around the world, right? Starting with the end of the Cold War in 1991. And we withdrew a lot of nuclear weapons from Europe. There was a time when we had 9,000 weapons, I think, nuclear weapons in Europe. That was not a particularly safe time. And so I would, hate to say it, but, politicians should look back a few decades. And, I understand the very, very real security situation and risks in the current landscape. But, in my view, nuclear weapons don't really add to security. But there is, of course, that perception, and several prominent politicians have expressed that.
Absolutely. Daryl, sort of a philosophical question, if you please, to change the tone of the conversation a little bit, because all we've been talking about so far is nuclear proliferation. But there are advocates, if you please, of an argument that perhaps there is a version of this scenario in which nuclear proliferation yields positive outcomes for global stability. Is there such a thing, like good nuclear proliferation at all?
No.
That's a very straightforward answer.
Earlier you asked, is the threshold, the risk of nuclear weapons use greater today than it ever has been? We have greater chance of nuclear weapons use by India or Pakistan, by North Korea against South Korea, or the United States against North Korea, the U.S. and China having an exchange, the U.S. and Russia, or NATO and Russia having a nuclear war, than I would say any point since the end of the Cold War. Having more countries with more nuclear weapons complicates the situation, increases the risk. But let me, if I could, briefly come back to your question earlier about Mr. Duda's comment. We all need to understand that today, NATO has, I should say, the United States has about 150 gravity bombs in 5 NATO countries: Turkey, Italy, the Netherlands, Germany, and these weapons can only be used by a joint decision of NATO as a whole, all of the member states of NATO. So if the proposal from some leaders in Poland is to take some of those U.S. gravity bombs to deploy them in Poland. Just from a security standpoint, it does not change the military advantages, if you will, of having any of those U.S. tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. It doesn't change the decision making. It does not change the fact that if one NATO member state were attacked by Russia, all states would need to respond. I think would be purely symbolic. It would be highly provocative. And the better way to address Poland's very real security concerns, which I'm very sympathetic to, given the statements of Donald Trump undermining confidence in the U.S. support for Article 5 and Russia's very aggressive approach, is to very quickly work more closely with NATO countries to fortify conventional nuclear forces to defend NATO against any potential future Russian attack. So I think that's a better approach than trying to upset this very uneasy balance that existed within NATO for decades on the U.S. nuclear sharing arrangement, which has been basically in effect since the late 1960s.
Words of wisdom from you, Daryl. Final question in few sentences to both of you. And I'm going to start with Daryl and then move to you, Sharon. In this age of no cooperation, or less cooperation than in the past, where might is right and power seems to be king, is there any hope for a nuclear arms control framework that would really diminish the risks? Daryl, what's your take?
Well, for decades, we have had competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, between NATO and Russia. And nuclear arms control has been an essential way to manage the risk of that global strategic competition. That is still the case today. What has changed over the last decade and a half is the United States and Russia have failed in advancing progress on nuclear arms control. China has been increasing the size of its arsenal, but China has stepped aside from or stayed away from any engagement on these issues because they argue we have a smaller nuclear arsenal than the U.S. and Russia. The future will require, a more stable future will require a resumption of the United States and Russia engaging in serious, practical nuclear arms control arrangements to reduce nuclear risk, to prevent a new nuclear arms race.
Okay, I'm gonna have to interrupt you here and move over to Sharon, so we squeeze both answers in.
Well, thanks. I agree entirely with Daryl's analysis. The one question is that crops up for me is with Donald Trump, whether there's, as much as we may dislike it, a better relationship with Vladimir Putin that could allow at least efforts to keep some guardrails in place. So we know that during the Biden administration, yes, New START was extended. That treaty will expire next year. And, unless we want to see an all-out nuclear arms race, we need to either, extend those provisions or negotiate a new treaty with Russia. There is some hope, in my view, that these better relationships, at least between the two leaders, could actually help to fashion something like that. But of course, all the political risks attendant with that. And I truly believe, we need a resolution, a fair and just resolution to the Ukraine war.
A hopeful note. A hopeful ending to this discussion. Sharon Squassoni and Daryl Kimball were our guests tonight. Thank you very much. Nuclear weapons are the biggest toys of them all. So big, in fact, that one should never play with them. There are no winners in nuclear wars, which is why they should never be fought. This seems like common sense, but in today's geopolitical chaos, nothing seems too obvious to repeat. Thank you for being with us tonight. Next week, we will tackle one of the most pressing issues in our parts of the world, the topic of Russian sabotage. Make sure you're with us next Wednesday, follow us on YouTube, and have a good evening.